It's just this idea that I really authentically believe people are in pursuit of more meaningful conversation. They just don't always know how. And if you've been touched by grief, the thing that I know is you get to this place of you really only want to talk about what matters. The reality is I think very few of us care how the Edmonton Oilers end up doing this year, and it's not that I
Yeah,
promise I recognize and believe how important the prices
that
of
is to
diesel and
people.
fertilizer are
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now,
yes,
but but when it's our turn to be in the front pew, there are going to be things that matter more, and
exactly.
it's not to reduce these things in the moment, but it's just when you've been touched by grief, we just really understand and begin to know what truly matters. Grief is our emotional and behavioral response to loss. Mourning is the
Mm.
opportunity to participate in that emotion. Grief is going to be the emotion that accompanies us when somebody we love dies. Mourning is going to be our opportunity to heal.
Welcome to the Farm Family Harmony podcast. I'm Elaine Fraze, Farm Family Coach, here with another episode full of transition tips, tactics, and sometimes hard truths to get harmony on your farm. Hey, folks, welcome to another edition of the Farm Family Harmony podcast. And I want to introduce you to my new friend, Jeremy Allen, who is from Provost, Alberta. We met online and then we saw each other just a month later at the Lake Country Co-op Conference for Farmers in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. But unfortunately, I didn't get to hear him speak because I had to go on to the next thing. And so today, I want to talk about, with Jeremy, helping farmers deal with death, grief, and loss. And don't run away. We're going to have a very fabulous conversation because here's what Jeremy says on his website. Where loss lives, grief will follow. And so, Jeremy's first things first, let's introduce yourself. Tell us your story. You're a lot younger than I am, but I'm not old enough to be your mother, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Tell us your current reality.
Yeah, well, first of all, I like to start these conversations with gratitude. I think anytime I have the opportunity to share this space of grief that I've come to admire so much, it always, that's just always coupled with a feeling
Mm.
of being grateful. So again, recognizing, I'm guessing most of your audience won't know me or have heard of me. My name's Jeremy Allen. I'm a funeral director and embalmer kind of by education. And then through that experiences and from walking alongside families over the last over 20 years of being in
Yeah,
funeral
2 decades.
service. Yeah, was just able to kind of take those experiences and truly use it as an environment to learn and take some lessons from that and bring them forward just with a recognition of grief being our emotional and behavioral response to loss, not specifically to people we love dying. And so it's just able to reapply a lot of that into some new environments and hopefully just start creating a bit of a different lens of grief for people to recognize it as an emotion that we're likely to experience, in multiple different ways throughout our life.
And I remember when my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when he was 84. That kind of grief is called ambiguous loss because as the dementia or Alzheimer's continues, you never know what's going to be lost next. And as we're recording this in the spring of 2026, and it will be released around the middle of May, I know a lot of farmers are grieving the fact of how expensive things cost with fertilizer and diesel prices and whatnot going. And I've even had a dairy farmer call me one day, Jeremy, and he said, Elaine, I can't stop crying. And I'll call him Charlie. And I said, Charlie, the reason you're crying is you loved your cows. And he sold his cows and he had huge grief. And it was a quite surprise because he said, Elaine, nobody died. So I think that's where you come in, Jeremy, in explaining. Your website, very interestingly, is called deathed.ca. So tell me where your journey is now. Are you still involved with funerals or have you moved on to something different?
Yeah, so still operationally full-time funeral directing and embalming. That is, I would say, my main career still, and then bringing these lessons into this place of speaking continues to kind of be, the passion project or the side hustle. A
Mhm.
lot of different things to call it, and purposefully, because I think as much opportunity as there is to continue to speak about these things, my heart very much still lies in being with families in those immediate parts of their loss, and because it equips me for those conversations with people. Like, we'll continue to use Charlie as an example of
Yeah.
grief, and even talking a little bit more about that bit you shared about your dad is it's in both of those. There's, for me, I immediately see parallels of this idea that it's called anticipatory grief, and it's this
Yes.
idea that we have the
Not knowing.
opportunity to prepare for loss, right? So you can
Mm.
you can with dementia have understanding that we know we're going to watch these people deteriorate over time, and feel like we'll have the opportunity to prepare for that. Or with an egg family where there's a succession plan, and we know that there is going to be a day that we have to sell the cows or turn it over to the next generations or whatever the case is. And there's sometimes an incredible amount of time to prepare for these things. But there's a difference in being prepared versus being ready. That,
So, yeah, so let's go down that trail a little bit because I have my healthcare directives lying on my table and an
sure.
appointment with our doctor next week with my husband and I to talk to him about what we want for end of life care and a
Yeah.
healthcare directive, which we've already tested out, unfortunately, with truck accidents. Anyway, that's another side story. But
Yeah.
what what is the difference between being prepared and being ready?
So I think the being prepared is that ducks in a row mentality, right? That functionally, when we run businesses, farms and things of this nature, we recognize the importance of having the documents in place. So in my setting, it's having a will, it's having had the conversations of what happens when I die functionally, the care of my
Mhm.
body and the care for my family and the things that follow. And again, easy for me to reapply this to the setting of, say, having a farm. I've never been
Mhm.
in ag, but I owned the funeral home business for over 17 years.
In
That
rural Alberta?
in rural Alberta here, yeah. And so
Mhm.
just knowing that we have to have these contingencies in place for the what ifs, right? And it's good and it's purposeful because I believe there's comfort and predictability, and I think there is a
Mhm.
relief attached to our families to have some of those structures in place. But then what gets really confusing for people is that when that time comes, even though we've been preparing for it, we're never ready to say goodbye. Like,
Yeah.
we're not ready to lose access to the physical presence of the people that we love. Where it would make sense to me that we're not ready to wake up one day and just not have to go milk the cows.
Mhm.
That because it is authentically a part of who we are. And
Right.
so that's for me the difference between being prepared versus being ready. I think we can have the documents, we can have the conversations, we can create the comfort of predictability of having steps to follow when we go through hard things or when we make big changes. But emotionally, I don't know how we can predict those same things, because it's different when it's our front pew at the funeral. It's different
Mhm.
when we're the ones watching the cows get loaded onto the trailer for the last time.
Mhm.
It's we accept it, I think, and the way that I've experienced this personally and talked about it professionally is that prepared versus ready is it's this idea that I believe cognitively we can walk ourselves through those steps and create understanding of them, but it's really hard to transfer that into our emotional behavior, right?
And quite yeah, and quite frankly, we don't know how we're gonna react to some of that deep loss and deep
Right.
grief. And I remember when my sister Gracie was killed by a drunk driver when she was 23 in November of 1988, the funeral director actually made a mistake, and he let everyone pass by us in that front pew, Jeremy, and I think I hugged 400 people.
Yeah.
Ooh, and that was tough. And, those are mistakes that everybody makes, you know, no harm, no foul. Everybody was expressing their loss and condolences, but before you even get to the funeral home, there's this thing called getting your documents in order, and I'm just looking over in the corner of my desk to this metal bucket that's full of documents and my life binder, and it needs updating. And even though I block on my Google Calendar, Elaine, today is going to be document day, I just have such a hard time getting to that next step of doing the updating. So the other day, because you were coming to visit me, I called the funeral home. So I get 1 star for calling the funeral home. And then I discovered that they have all these online tools at the funeral home to help you get that kick started and start organizing and getting your stuff in order. But I also have a funeral coach, and her name is Joy, and she was supposed to be my accountability partner. And she works with the company that sells paid funerals and whatnot, which, again, folks, you know, I'm a very strong advocate for financial planning. And I think the other thing, because of the work that you've had 2 decades of experience in, Jeremy, too, what is it going to take people to understand that their funeral has to be taken care of at some point? But it also is a good idea to have it paid for. So just imagine with me, I have neighbors here who are aging in their mid 70s, late 80s. I even have a neighbor who's turning 95 next week.
Mhm.
Um, why are they not getting this done? Like, what is it about death and facing the fact that, you know, ducks in a row is a much better thing? Because you said, Elaine, there's comfort in predictability. And I say, you know, families living in uncertainty just creates what I call the pain of not knowing. So, how can you help encourage our listeners to just take that next step to get through that barrier, chuck aside the fact that they do need to know things and they need to create more predictability in their life?
Yeah, I think it's, I'll make sure I return to the question, but I'll
Okay.
kind of, make sense of why not, right? You know,
Okay.
and it's, for me, it's this evolution of emotion, you know,
Okay.
so when we look at the different generations, so I'm 40 turning 41. My parents are in their mid 60s, and then, you know, my grandparents have passed away, but they would have all been in their 80s and 90s now, right? So if I look at those 3 generations of time, well, my grandparents grew up in a generation where emotions authentically didn't serve purpose, because if you grew up in war, if you grew up in famine, if you grew up in a genuine
Depression.
environment of depression and scarcity, oftentimes emotions interfered with survival. You know, we didn't
Mm,
have time to
interesting.
stop and think about how the lack of what we have access to is making us
Like
feel like
food.
we,
Yeah.
right, you know, food, shelter, water were not readily available, you know. And
Yeah.
so, and then those people raised my parents, you know, in a continued environment of scarcity. Even though things started to become more accessible, they were directly connected to living without, right? And then my parents, you know, raised our generation, and where things started to shift. And the emotional evolution of that was, so my grandparents' generation was quite unequipped to talk about emotion, but it makes sense because it didn't serve a purpose for most of their life, you know. And then my
Okay.
parents' generation, it started to shift where they became a little bit more emotionally intelligent. And when we came along, we started to force them to kind of have to be more emotionally present. And it kind of developed in this way where, hey, it's okay if you guys have emotions and talk about them, but we're going to keep ours behind closed doors. You know, like, it
Mm,
wasn't things that we talked about in front of our kids. And now our generation is kind of, the pendulum is swinging in a much
mhm.
different direction, where we're trying to learn how to find the language to have these conversations with our kids, and be more present in those experiences.
Well,
And
and also getting a big sense of overwhelm too,
right, you know, and
right?
so where that brings me back to is, you know, when we enter those conversations of why there's often hesitation in that. So, number one, it takes an incredible amount of vulnerability, which again historically wasn't looked at as a strength. I think it is now, you know. But and the other part too is, there is a bit of an irrational fear that if I talk about this, I'm manifesting my death, right? You know, that
Okay,
it's
yeah.
just
So if you
like,
talk about it, it's going to happen.
Right, and
Okay.
it's just not true, and so where I usually have success in these conversations is helping people recognize because again, when we go back through those generations, whether it's my grandparents' generation or my parents' generation, you know, one of the things that authentically ties us all together is this genuine desire to take care of our families,
Yeah.
right? And so by choosing to have these difficult conversations and make some of these difficult decisions, it's an act of love.
Okay.
It's an extension of the relationship in a way that allows you to continue to take care of your family even after you're gone, right? And
Right.
the reason for that is there's the hardest families for us to meet with as funeral directors are the ones that sit at the table and tell us dad never talked about what he wanted,
Yes. Closed
right?
book.
Yeah, and now they're left trying to
Yeah.
guess and trying to honor them in a way that they see fit, and usually how they do that is, "Well, this is what we did for grandpa and grandma," or, "This is what we did for mom," or this right? You know, where we just start kind of making decisions based off of what we've done before, and like we know in anything in life, the way that we made decisions 2 generations ago hardly ever apply to life now, right? And so I think it's important to be active in that decision as an individual, you know, where even if we can just get some of those base level decisions done, like, you know, in most of Canada, there's typically two forms of what we would call final dispositions of care,
Mhm.
which is burial and cremation, right? You know, like what does that look like? And within that, you know, do you still want your family to have like that's just the final step. So do we still want your family to have the opportunity to have a viewing? Do we still want, you
Mhm.
know, like, and it's just walking through those steps and realizing there are parts of this that are healthy for you to give direction on. And then there's parts of this that are healthy to leave for your family to choose because we want to be activated in our grief. Grief is our emotional and behavioral response to loss. Mourning is the
Mhm.
opportunity to participate in that emotion. And there's a gentleman, his name's Dr. Alan Wolfelt, and he talks about those differences. And ultimately, where it leads is to this idea that, you know, grief is going to be the emotion that accompanies us when somebody we love dies. Mourning is going to be our opportunity to heal.
And that I think is what I see in our small town that I'm concerned about, Jeremy, is the opportunity to heal through mourning is being cut off. And
Hmm.
and that we in our town we have these little white carts from the funeral service, Wheatland.
Hmm.
And I you go shopping at Co-op or you go to the post office and you see the white cards, and the most cards I've ever seen at one time are 7. 7
Hmm.
cards lined up, and so 7 families have experienced some kind of loss of all different ages and stages. And then on the bottom it says, "There will be a private ceremony at a later time according to the family's wishes." And I just go, "Oh, that's so too bad."
Right.
Because I just and I'd like to hear your perspective on that because I've been doing a
Yeah.
lot of coaching. I'm, in this season of waiting for the soil to warm up so we can go seeding hopefully by the 1st of May. Hopefully by the time this is recorded, we've already had a good couple of weeks of seeding. So I'm in this space right now of doing a lot of coaching calls and talking to a lot of people about helping them discover how they want to get to the table to talk about transition. So
Yeah.
you're talking to us about how do we get families to the table to talk about the emotion of grief, which is going to come with loss, and
Yeah.
that loss may come through a death, but also mourning also comes it's like a lament too. It's like an opportunity for the family and the community to recognize that people are in deep pain and that we all walk alongside together. But if you don't have a funeral, if you don't have a graveside service or some kind of marking, some people even will come to me and say, "Elaine, did he die? I can't remember because there was no funeral."
Right. Yeah.
So
I've got
explain
lots to say
why
on
is
this topic.
yeah, I really
Yeah.
wanna hear what you have to say because you're the
Yeah.
first person that I've ever seen that wants to have death as an education, and that's why
Right.
we have this podcast because all of these farm families, they don't need extra stress in their life, Jeremy, so they need guidance and wisdom and practical tools of, "Here's a way that you can navigate grief and
Right.
loss."
Yeah, and so I again, it's funny. I mean, I know this is a podcast, so people won't see my face, but these conversations light me
Well,
up
they are
because
gonna
they
see
are
your face on the
oh
YouTube
good.
channel, so keep
Yeah,
smiling.
so it is education, and the
Yeah.
reality is I joke that, funeral is the new F word, and a lot of
Okay.
that is because it reverse engineers into what we experienced as, going to funerals throughout our life. And again,
Mm,
I'll kind of explain this in my own setting. So I grew up in a
okay.
very religious setting, and so when I look back at what funerals have looked like, throughout my life, well, if I'm under the impression that a funeral is having to go to a church, having a very traditional, very ritualistic type service, where
Service.
my
Mhm.
my body is up at the front of the church and basically is I'm following the traditions that were laid upon me throughout my life, and that is the expectation of what my funeral is supposed to look like. Well, if that were my only option, I would be pretty funeral resistant also because
Mm,
number one, it's not a proper reflection of who I've become. And more importantly to me, is that wouldn't serve my children well,
mm.
because that also wouldn't be the environment that they would mourn comfortably, and
Or
that they
find
would
comfort
mourn
in. Yeah.
right. And so when I help families and when we have this conversation and I've certainly sat at the table and listened to families that say like, mom didn't want anything, she
Yeah,
wasn't fancy, she was,
typically.
right, and she was a very simple lady and she didn't want anything. And to me it's just like that's just such an invitation to start asking questions,
Mhm.
tell me more about your mom, what was important to her, what was her relationship like with her family? What was her
Family
relationship
was
like
hugely important.
with her friends, right? And you
Mhm.
start recognizing that grief is completely rooted in relationship. And then helping redefine, and I think this is where I really lean on my fellow professionals that we have a responsibility to help redefine what funerals are. Well, a funeral to me is when we recollect in the relationships that were a part of that life on a specific day, on a specific time, at a specific place. And of
Right.
course, that can still be in a church setting. For some families, that's still incredibly important and relevant, but it also can be at the community hall. It could also
Yes.
be in a completely informal way, like, maybe it's at the curling rink or maybe it's just a barbecue at the farm. But the
Yeah.
idea is that we intentionally set a date and time and place aside that we are going to create the
To remember
opportunity
and
to
celebrate.
bring these relationships together. And maybe that is more private. Maybe that is just a family supper, or maybe it's something that still includes, a close group of friends and whoever is appropriate within that. And that's where I become unassuming. It's not to insert who I think should be present, but we need to have something. I think it's really sad when life just ends because the thing that I know is internally it's going to create a lot of turmoil, and what becomes I've seen what I've watched in those environments where people choose to keep their grief
Not
very private and have nothing. Funerals have also just historically been the place where we allow people to join us in our loss, right?
and
And
cry
it's not that
together.
yeah,
Yes.
and even if we don't share that space of emotion, we've still created space for people to join us. And so it's just when we see them at the local IGA, or when we run into them at the next community function, it's less awkward.
Mhm.
It's when we, I think for most people, it's like if we meet someone in public and we know somebody that they love has died and they didn't have anything and they chose just to keep everything very private, human behavior is that we assume they don't want to talk about it. And
Right.
that's almost never true, right? But it's just how we've adapted that. Like that's kind of been the human behavior response to when families don't have anything is people are afraid to talk to them about it, right?
The
And
other thing
so
I Yeah, so go ahead.
no, that's yeah, I'll
People,
let you.
people being afraid to talk, and my sister's name was Grace, and when I meet a little girl in girls club who I'm teaching, and say, "Oh, I just love your name," and they say, "Why?" I said, "Well, you're the same name as my sister." And speaking the person's name and keeping their memory alive is also, I think, part of the healing journey. But we just had this funeral in our town of a 95-year-old woman named Dorothy, who was a fabulous singer. And they couldn't have the funeral in the church because it's 100 years old and the stained glass window is getting fixed. So they did have it, Jeremy, in the Legion Hall.
Yeah.
But what's so fascinating about her funeral bulletin is she chose at the back of the bulletin, and it was called Lessons from Dorothy, and it was a beautiful tribute, but that she wrote herself just
Yeah.
in 2 or 3 short words. Breathe, keep short repair of accounts, dress well, laugh often. Like, she had all these little one-liners, but this woman had 18 grandchildren and 21 great-grandchildren. She had a massive family, and it was such a great funeral in my mind because it was a celebration of family and relationship. And it was a time to tell story, and I think as a speaker and, you understand the power of story, and when you're on this, passion project, you call it, to speak it, to farm families about, how they feel about grief and loss, it's a beautiful opportunity to just share a story of how it's made a difference, I think, to the healing journey, because the loss I witness is the loss of health as farmers decline as they age in place, and then the fact that a loss of control because they're hanging on for dear life to land or equipment or assets, and it's very hard for them to trust that the next generation's not gonna screw up and lose everything or whatever their stories are telling herself. And, my dad was born in 1926, so he was a child. I mean, in 1936, my dad was 10 years old. And I always joke that I'm just like my grandmother, his mother. I still wash plastic bags, and people says, "Who does that?" In 2026. Well, I do, and I'm not afraid to say that I have some of these interesting frugalities that I inherited from my father and my grandmother. So all of this to say, Jeremy, what you've just said is it's important to have a funeral as some kind of marker, but it doesn't have to be in traditional form if that doesn't suit the character or the culture
Right.
of the family. And I have written a blog, which people can just Google, called Has Your Funeral Been Planned? And one of the most fun ones I ever went to was the grandpa who was the golfer. And all the kids wrote their names on a golf ball and threw it into the open casket before they lowered it into the grave.
Hmm.
I've also seen kids take black Sharpie markers and write messages to grandma on her $5,000 casket. And some of the older people are going, "Oh, they're writing on the casket." And I'm saying, "Hey, these messages are healing for these little children who are really gonna miss their grandma," right?
Right. Yeah. And I think when we see life displayed in those ways, it's just such evidence of legacy,
Mm,
and one of the things I know to be true about grief is we can only experience loss to the level in which we've experienced relationship.
wow,
So
yeah.
if we're feeling it so deeply, it's because they took the time to be a mom and to be a
Yeah.
grandma, and they were intentional about relationship. And these are the emotional parts of the conversation for me because I've been on the receiving end of this. And what
Mm,
you start to realize, and what's maybe been a wonderful perspective through my career, is how many people forget to do that.
mhm.
So if you were lucky enough to have somebody in your life that invested into you, that I mean, I think we have a level of expectation from our parents, or I hope we
Yeah.
do. And I say that as a parent. Um,
Yes.
but but when we have grandparents or aunts and uncles, or sometimes just really good friends, people that didn't have to have the same type of skin in the game, that just
Mm,
invest without expectation, without judgment, without, hoping for something in return,
return.
it just, it changes the trajectory of who we become. And then when we get to the end of those lives, and we try to recapture them in those days of the service, and what I love about it is what I believe again to be true is very seldomly do our moms and our dads or our grandpas and our grandmas sit us down and say, "This is what it's going to look like when I'm gone." Right?
Mm, Yeah.
But when you've had the experience of them investing in you throughout your life, what you realize is in these daily moments or weekly moments or in these small, what seemed like small lessons, they've spent your entire life equipping you for when they're gone by
Yeah.
teaching you, by creating safe spaces for you, by showing up authentically. And it's just such a wonderful thing to be a part of. And it's why I love grief, is and that
Mm.
is hard for some people to understand at times because
You're really
yeah,
weird,
it is.
Jeremy. You're
Yeah,
just a little weird.
100%. Yeah. But and because I know how hard it's going to be.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I joke about it for myself. I go like, I hope people are completely devastated when I die, and it's
Mm.
because that will be a sign that I lived well,
Or that you live
and
very deeply and intentionally into their lives
right.
as well.
And I hope my kids' initial response is they don't know how they're going to do this without me. And
Mm.
then I hope they realize I've also spent my life equipping them to do this without me.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's just such a neat thing to just sit and absorb and then try to, as best we can, adjust our behavior to live a life that is purposeful, that is meaningful, that is rooted in relationship. And yeah, I think all of these things that we typically are afraid of about what happens when I die are these living opportunities to create more meaningful relationship.
And I was just a guest listener, and I was in the audience today earlier of a webinar that Dan Aberhart did with Patty Duran and Chris Corbett from Bright Track Consulting. And Patty's a very dear friend of mine who's written a book called The Future Leader .ca, which is her website. But this comment came out, and I thought, wow, I gotta tell this to Jeremy today. She said, "Have you put relationships on your balance sheet? Are they a liability or are they an asset?" And I thought that's extremely powerful for her to say that as part of what she calls her truthing process when people are having conversations about expectations. And the webinar today was about parents talking to their heirs about inheritance and business succession. Like, what are your expectations from me? Are there any specific items that are meaningful to you and how that you would like to inherit? And I need you to understand that farm assets are necessary for operating the business. And by having this conversation, I'm not giving you authority over your decisions and wishes, but I want to hear your perspective. And the same
Mhm,
thing can be translated to what we're talking about funerals and end of life and legacy pieces, because I want every person listening to this podcast, Jeremy, to finish well and
mhm,
to not leave their family in chaos with the pain of
right.
not knowing.
Yeah, and I think the idea is just that, like, if we desire to live well, we should desire to die well,
Mhm.
and I think there's this, I know I've referenced this in my own worlds in the past of like, it's this idea that, like, we have the opportunity of taking life and creating an ongoing living memory by having
Mm.
meaningful conversation, right? And the thing is I know it's hard, and I mean, again, I'm a dad.
Yeah.
I have personal relationship in my life, and we go through hard things. And when we talk about grief and we talk about the hardship of entering these conversations with the people we love, it's something I'm continuing to learn to practice personally also. But what's so neat about it to me is I have 3 kids, they're 15,
Mm.
13, and 9, and a type of grief that we're walking through right now as a family is divorce, that their
Yes.
mom and I made the decision to separate and pursue divorce. And the thing is again, historically, we left kids out of these conversations.
Yeah.
We didn't feel like it was appropriate for them to be a part of it. And it isn't appropriate for them to be a part of everything, but we know there are parts of this that are going to be hard for them. And the thing that I've learned about grief and talking with our families about it and talking with our kids about it, especially younger kids, is why it's so necessary is when we don't, like when we leave them with those emotions, when we leave them with those thoughts, they almost always engineer into fear, right?
Right.
And
Fear
and the
and
thing
making
is,
up their own stories.
right, and so for me to introduce the conversation and talk about the parts of it that are appropriate, that are hard for me, what it does is it normalizes those parts of the experience without kind of dehumanizing it,
Yeah.
because if the behavior that they're watching is just me absorbing this all and kind of taking on that traditional lens of ignore and override, then that becomes the expectation that that's what they're supposed to do too. And the thing that, like, especially when we talk about in that environment of grief and people we love dying, is it should be hard. Like when somebody we love dies, it should be accompanied by emotion. So the goal isn't to remove the emotion from the experience, the goal is to remove the fear. And the way that we do that is by talking about it.
And putting it on out because love does not read minds. And I have no
Right.
idea how you're grieving unless I sit beside you and
Right.
ask and say, Jeremy, what does support look like to you? And then
Yeah.
you get to tell me what you need in the moment. And it might
Yeah.
not be anything. It may say, Elaine, I just want you to be here. I don't need you to say anything.
Right. Yeah. There's a lady, Megan Devine, and
Mm,
she says, show up, listen, don't fix. That
yeah.
it's just about presence. That's
Mhm.
ultimately what it comes down to. And when we introduce our kids into these conversations, the steps that I've learned to follow is if I truly want to get to a point of knowing what's going on in their minds and in their hearts, then there are steps to follow. And it's, we need to lead with vulnerability, which is us talking
Yeah.
about our parts of the experience that are appropriate to share. Because when we
Hmm.
lead with that excruciating vulnerability, it creates a deeper connection. Deeper
Hmm.
connection builds higher levels of trust. Higher levels of trust lead to more meaningful relationship. And if I can get to that step with you, that's where we're going to start to introduce the opportunity for you to actually share what's going on in your world. But if I skip any of those steps, my opinion is I'm maybe undeserving of actually hearing what's going on in your life.
And to that point, Jeremy, I hope that when that vulnerability happens, that there's mutual trust and respect.
Hmm.
Because Brene Brown, as we know, has done lots of talks on vulnerability and shame and blame and all those things. But
Yeah,
in farm families, the ones who start to open that crack, and especially for the older generations where it's just totally against, like you said before, the culture of how they were raised or the age and stage that they came and what they saw their parents doing, for them to have the courage to open up and to trust that the vulnerability will be honored and respected,
hmm,
and held well in a safe space, that's really, really huge. That's really,
it
really
is. and
important.
and learning to kind of, I'll be honest, call out some of the people from my generation of saying, like, listen, I can recognize the imperfections of sometimes what our parents or our grandparents
Mm,
did at times, and
yeah.
and truly just, and it's not that, again, it's not that it can't be conversation, but we need to do a better job of recognizing. Maya Angelou talks about this. She says, we do
Yeah.
the best we can until we know better. And then when we know better, we need to do better. And
Do
if you
better.
can look at our parents or your parents and your grandparents and authentically realize they were doing the best they can, whether there was imperfections or not, it just doesn't matter. Like, this is where it's like, we just need to be in the present and realize that when they bring that vulnerability forward to us, our responsibility is to meet them without judgment and expectation, that it needs to be met with that safety so that we can all grow together in these moments.
Well, and it
Yeah.
also says in the word that mercy triumphs over judgment, and
Yeah,
that's, as you're planning, funerals or gatherings or celebration of life or whatever you wanna call them, you really want to do it with kindness. I just wanna grab a piece of paper here that, um,
sure.
I was playing around yesterday for my membership group about how to go from a light start conversation to a deeper one. So here's the interesting thing. First one's called warm up. What's one thing that's gotten better than you expected lately on the farm or off? And what part of your week feels the most steady or settled right now? So for you, it might be my girls are happy going to baseball and my son's finished hockey and,
Yeah.
it's spring and things are changing,
Right.
right? Next round is the goal is gentle honesty, which is called shared reality. What's been taking up the most mental space for you these days? And for farmers, of course, it's the timelines around seeding and planting, high prices of diesel and fertilizer, all the financial stress. But another good question for shared reality is, when do you feel most like a team right now? And when do you feel a bit out of sync? And then it says, notice patterns, don't try to solve them. And I think that's interesting what you said about sit, listen, but don't fix. So do you wanna say that why are people, when people are dying and trying and burying the dead and honoring the dead, why are they trying to fix things then?
Yeah, I think it's just our instinct,
Okay.
that we watched again, previous generations of that that tried to guard us from the hardship of saying goodbye, right? And especially when I watch what happened more specifically around kids, where parents often tried to create this shield of like, the less we involve you, the less,
Yeah.
you're exposed to this, the less it will
No.
hurt. Because
No.
and it's
No.
just not true. And I think, so the introduction into that part is to probably refocus on the word of acknowledgement, and where it's just, again, it's this idea that we just allow everybody to show up, without that judgment or expectation. And my favorite quote that I always refer to in acknowledgement is a gentleman by the name of Parker Palmer. And he
Oh,
says, the
I
human
love his
soul,
work.
yeah, says the human soul does not want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed exactly as it is. So whether
Mm,
it's the person dying or whether it's the people sitting next to that bedside, we know there's nothing that can be done to fix what's happening, and it's actually not the desire. All we just need is just the people to sit there with us, to be in our presence and just allow us to feel the intensity of the emotion. Because you know what?
mhm.
The thing that I've learned in these moments is that if we try to push down on the emotion, if we try to reduce it, you can't just
Stuff
reduce
it there.
singular emotion. So if I'm going to push down on the sadness and the hardship, it also is going to interfere with my opportunity to experience gratitude and joy.
I get it.
And probably going back, I'm gonna kind of go back to those conversations about your dad earlier, and
Mm.
in when and I've had a similar experience. One of my grandparents had Alzheimer's and dementia, and I remember at the end of her life, and one of the unique parts about being a funeral director is I actually cared for 3 out of my 4 grandparents.
Wow,
And,
yeah.
uh, and so I remember getting the call that my grandma had passed away,
Mhm.
and going to the nursing home, and it was late. It was like at 2 in the morning, and so I get up and I put my suit on and I do my hair, and I head to the nursing home. And 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 I remember getting to the doorway of her room, and again, like that prepared versus ready, right? We knew this
Yeah.
was coming,
Yeah.
and like being overcome with emotion.
Yeah.
And but then, like, simultaneous to the sadness, there was relief and
Yes,
gratitude,
her
you know?
suffering was over.
Yeah, and I think that's where I caution trying to push down on any of it, because we need to feel both parts. And what's so unique about grief is grief for me has been the only environment that I've learned where contrasting emotions aren't just going to be a part of the same experience, they're oftentimes a part of the same moment, right?
Wow, which is
That
really like, what is happening here,
right,
right?
and that really
You're having
confuses
a great
people.
family joke, and then you're crying buckets of tears. And people say,
Yeah,
I remember when we were writing my father-in-law's obituary, my husband and I and one of his sisters, we were laughing and having a great time, and the other sister was mortified, and they said, "Well, how can you be having such a good time?" And we go, "Hey, man, we've had 6 months to grieve. You just arrived yesterday." So it was a
yeah,
whole timing issue, right? But
yeah.
that's a very
And
good observation. Yeah.
and I think too is like, if we're gonna put ourselves through the hardship of grief, or we're gonna be out in the rain, and feeling the intensity of the sadness, which is I think we need to do, then allow yourself the warmth of a good day. And
Mm.
the thing is when we try to rush out of the hardship, we feel undeserving of the good stuff,
And
right?
we have to be
So
able to receive that too. Yeah.
Right, and so it just and I've seen that so often, the family the individuals that don't embrace the hardship, they find themselves laughing. They find themselves in the midst of a funny story, and then they rush out of that moment too, because again, I think there's this unspoken thing happening somewhere in our mind going like, I don't deserve to feel happy. Who would feel
Mm,
happy right now? And the thing is like, well, joy is a part of grief. Grief
mm,
isn't described as a sad emotion. It's a multitude of emotion, right? And
mhm.
but that gets really confusing for people because we were always again brought up in happy or sad, you know?
Well, I think we just need a bigger vocabulary, Jeremy, which is why
Right.
now the internet has a thing called an emotion wheel, and it has like
Yes.
52 emotions, and you can pick the one that you're feeling simultaneously now.
Right.
And I have these lovely feelings cards that I use with my grandchildren that goes beyond mad or sad or glad or happy
Yeah.
because we need more. And I'm sure with your kids, as you're discussing, their new situation of co-parenting that, they need language as they grow to be able to express themselves. Even farmers who are 55, 65, or 85, they need language too because they just say,
Right.
"Elaine, I've never told anybody this before," and they start, there's a tear that's coming out of the corner of their eye, and I go, "Great." And they go, "What do you mean, great?" I said, "You're finally learning how to grieve. There's tears, there's
Yeah.
emotion. This is
Again,
a good thing."
I get the big smiles because I love it. I'm a big part of my career in funeral service has been learning to walk kids through grief. And,
Yes.
I've learned it's just number 1, of course, it's important for them, but it's also the gateway to teaching the adults,
And
where
and they can set the example.
yeah, and the thing that I love about it is, like, we do have 3, sometimes 4 generations of people that don't have the language, so I'll be in the funeral home, and I'll be kneeling down and explaining to the little
I love
guys,
it.
how we've been talking ab how we've been helping take care of great grandma and walking them through the steps in an age appropriate way, and then I look up, and the 75-year-olds are just absolutely dialed in on this conversation because nobody's ever explained it to them.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And so that's the part where even as adults, we have to begin to recognize that, like, if nobody taught us, it's not fair to think you know what to do. So
Mhm,
yes, we need to engage. Now, the difference between being 41 and being 5 years old is I have the ability to recognize I have the opportunity to participate in these conversations at a higher level, right? And
mhm,
and not just the opportunity, likely the responsibility to participate in these experiences at a higher level because I desire to be a good son and to be a good dad
mhm.
and to be a good brother and maybe be a good partner again one day to somebody,
Yeah.
right? And if that is my desire, then it becomes a responsibility as much as it is an opportunity.
So, Jeremy, I found you, through my business partner, Lydia, because she heard you on a podcast and thought you had an
Yeah.
amazing perspective. And then I got to meet you in person and give you a big hug after we got
Yeah.
to see each other face to face. And that just reminded me too, and then I wanted to say this as we work to closing off, but it is really important when people die that you show up. Whether you
Yeah.
show up at the funeral or whether you show up at the farm or whether you show up at the coffee shop or you speak the person's name because I remember several occasions where I was the only person from my town that took the 3-hour drive to honor somebody's mother, and they just said, "Oh, Elaine." And I said, "It's okay." But it's because I've had, burying my sister at 23 and my father-in-law
Yeah.
10 months before my mother, and then my mother-in-law and my father-in-law getting diagnosed with life-changing illnesses the same week. So I've done palliative care 4 times, and I'm a big believer in let's talk about loss, let's encourage one another, and let's walk alongside. So if
Yeah.
people wanna get more of your insights, you have a newsletter. So what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Yeah. So definitely through my website, which is www.deathed.ca.
Pretty easy to
And
find.
pretty easy to find. And it was funny when I came up with, the name for this business. It was just this idea, of that it's just education based, no different than phys ed or any
Mhm.
type of, you're right. And so that was kind of my play on words with that. I'm pretty active on social media, so Instagram and Facebook would kind of be my two main platforms. And what I love about social media in that setting is it's just my journal. I just,
Mm.
write these thoughts and then let the world read it. And I think it's just this goal of helping find common places for us to find these thoughts, and what I'm really enjoying about it is watching this grief community build, and the way that they interact with, whether it's my words or whether it's the way I watch them start to interact with each other and support each other. It's just this idea that I really authentically believe people are in pursuit of more meaningful conversation. They just don't always know how. And if you've been touched by grief, the thing that I know is you get to this place of you really only want to talk about what matters. The reality is I think very few of us care how the Edmonton Oilers end up doing this year, and it's not that I
Yeah,
promise I recognize and believe how important the prices
that
of
is to
diesel and
people.
fertilizer are
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now,
yes,
but when it's our
yes,
turn to be in the front pew, there are going to be things that matter more, and
exactly.
it's not to reduce these things in the moment, but it's just when you've been touched by grief, we just really understand and begin to know what truly matters.
And so that's a great, soundbite, to remember what truly matters. The other thing you said that really caught me was, "Don't ignore and override."
Yeah.
And that means, folks, it's a great life lesson too for conflict resolution and knowing the conversations that you need to have, but you keep avoiding. And so once you get into this deeper truth section of this talk thing I found on ChatGPT is, in the end, you wanna be grounded but not raw. So what's the one thing you appreciate about how the other person is handling this and what's imperfect? And you talked about imperfect parenting or imperfect founders or grandparents, whatever, that they don't have the language that they need, but you're helping educate them and see it deeper what they need. And then the other thing is, what would help you feel a little more supported in the next few weeks? And I have a friend right now that's in a hard place with cancer, and I just asked her directly. The question I said was, "How would you like to be supported?" And her
Mhm.
answer was, "Elaine, I just want to spend time with my friends and family."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty
So,
powerful, you know?
yeah, and very
But we
clear.
but we don't but we just don't know if we don't ask, and
Right. Yeah.
sometimes the intimidation of asking that question interferes with some really wonderful opportunities, because if you get the chance to sit with this friend, I bet it's
Mm,
very unlikely you talk about the weather,
exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Like it just
We talk we
yeah,
talk about our grandchildren and having 15 more years to be able to give them legacy and mentor them. And I have to stand aside, Jeremy, because this is a new backdrop for my podcast. So this is a
yeah,
picture of
very
me
cool.
walking down the lane with my two granddaughters before my grandson arrived. And it was painted by Mario Busio, who's a retired pastor friend of mine. And it's very special because it's also good to remember in the work I do to remember what's truly important and how
Yeah,
we all want to finish well. So excited to finally have you and hear all the good
yeah,
things that you're doing. And I will share this far and wide and ask the people who are listening to know and remember that if you're listening to this on the podcast, it's also on YouTube for maybe some of the older generation who like to have it on their laptop and see our faces and our expressions, but also to understand that the time is now and you can start talking about it while you're going up and down the fields in the spring. Get that little notepad out of your shirt pocket. Don't spend too much time on your screen on your phone, but just write down some thoughts about ideas that you'd like to share with your fans and family so they know what kinds of things are important to you. So we're going to sign off now for this time, and it's the end of this podcast season. We're going to take a break for a couple of months, and we'll be back in August. And I want to say thank you, Jeremy, again, and all the best to those amazing young children that you're parenting, and also to all those people in Alberta who are privileged to have you not just take care of things physically, but especially nurture them
Yeah. Well,
emotionally,
thank
because
you.
that's just really, really super
Yeah.
important. Thanks,
It
friends, for
matters.
joining
Yeah.
us today. Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And again, if you want to find Jeremy's work, all you have to do is go to www.deathed.ca, sign up for his newsletter. And also, folks, just follow things on social media and share things far and wide to really encourage those people, because we're never alone. And grief is not only the loss of death, it can be the loss of other things as well. And stay healthy. And the last thing I'll say is go to domorag.com/ag talk. And if you need a place to talk and chat about some of the loss and hard things that you might be experiencing in this season of farming, please don't keep it to yourself. Jeremy said you don't need to keep things to yourself and inside. Make sure you're getting it out so that you can stay healthy as well. We'll see you next time and hope you have a great seeding season. Bye for now.